It's 1943. The skies over Europe belong to the Luftwaffe. The German pilots are kings of the air. Their Messerschmitt, Bf-109s and Focke-Wulfs slicing through clouds like scalpels. The Allies' bombers tremble when they appear, for each engagement ends the same way. A smoking Allied plane spiraling toward the earth below. And then they see something new, a slow, thick-bodied American plane wobbling in from the west. It looks less like a bird of prey and more like a steel refrigerator with wings. The German pilots can't help but laugh. Was es das? Ein fliegender Ziegelstein? A flying brick. They joke over the radio, betting who will be the first to knock it out of the sky. They didn't know that this chunky newcomer would soon become their worst nightmare. But at that moment, the P-47 Thunderbolt was a joke. American pilots weren't thrilled either. They looked at this monster and said, "You've got to be kidding." It was huge, 5 tons of metal and engine, with wings broader than any other single-engine fighter. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, but secretly they meant milk jug. It wasn't fast enough, it wasn't nimble enough, and it looked like it had eaten 3 Spitfires for breakfast. So yes, everyone laughed, even the pilots who were supposed to fly it. The engineers at Republic Aviation, however, weren't laughing. They knew exactly what they had built, an airborne sledgehammer. The Thunderbolt wasn't made to dance. It was made to destroy. While others built delicate birds of prey, Republic built a flying bulldozer powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a beast of a radial engine capable of producing more than 2,000 horsepower. If planes were athletes, the Thunderbolt was the heavyweight boxer. Not pretty, but one punch and you were done. Early missions didn't help its reputation. P-47 pilots struggled to climb quickly enough to intercept enemy aircraft, and its short range meant it couldn't escort bombers deep into Germany. Many were lost before they could even engage the enemy. A German ace famously said, "If I see a P-47, I know 2 things. It can't catch me, and it can't escape me." Brutal words, but not entirely wrong. The Thunderbolt was too heavy, too sluggish at first glance. It needed altitude to fight effectively, and that meant rookie pilots were sitting ducks at low levels. But every joke hides a grain of misunderstanding, and the Luftwaffe had completely misread their new opponent. The P-47 had something no other fighter could match: raw durability. It could take a beating, shrug off cannon shells, and still make it home. Some pilots returned with holes the size of dinner plates in their wings, or with an entire cylinder missing from their engine. Yet the plane kept flying, grumbling and growling like an angry bear refusing to die. This was no delicate Spitfire. This was an airborne tank, and the Germans, smug in their sleek fighters, were about to learn that the sky had room for a new kind of predator. The Thunderbolt's pilots began to notice its quirks weren't weaknesses. They were armor. The heavy frame that made it slow in a climb also made it nearly indestructible. The oversized engine that made it look ridiculous gave it unmatched power in a dive. It couldn't always chase, but it could always choose when to fight. When a P-47 dropped from altitude, gravity itself joined the battle. A German pilot who found one above him had seconds to live. Still, that moment was in the future. In 1943, the P-47 was still climbing toward its destiny. The pilots were frustrated, the Luftwaffe was laughing, and command was skeptical. Why, they wondered, were they trusting so much steel to such an ungainly brute? But every legend starts as an underdog, and every underdog has its day coming. Somewhere over an English airfield, a new batch of Thunderbolts warmed up their engines. The ground trembled under their roar. The mechanics covered their ears as the sound hit like artillery. Those who had laughed began to realize this milk jug wasn't just big, it was angry. The Luftwaffe could laugh all it wanted, but the jug was about to stop being the punchline and start being the punch. The first time the P-47 met the Luftwaffe in real combat, the skies above northern France echoed with both thunder and frustration. The big American fighter roared like a storm, but often arrived too late to join the fight. Pilots cursed its sluggish climb rate as the Germans dove out of the sun and vanished before the Thunderbolts could even level their wings. Reports flowed back to command. "It's too heavy. Too slow. Can't escort our bombers far enough." The plane that had promised dominance looked like a disappointment, and the Luftwaffe kept laughing, but those who flew it began to notice something strange. When other fighters took a few hits and went down, the P-47s came limping home, sometimes on one cylinder, sometimes trailing smoke, leaking oil, holes stitched all across the fuselage. Yet somehow that huge radial engine refused to quit. Pilots began to trust the brute. They learned to use its size as an advantage, its weight as a weapon. The first true test came in mid-1943. Bomber crews flying daylight raids into occupied France were desperate for protection. The Thunderbolts were assigned as escorts. When German interceptors appeared, the Jugs had to climb like mad to meet them. Dogfights turned chaotic. Light, agile Bf-109s swirling around massive P-47s. On paper, the Germans should have wiped them out. But in practice, the Thunderbolt had one trick up its sleeve. It could dive faster than anything else in the sky. Once those 2,000 horses kicked in, gravity joined the party, and the Jug became a falling anvil with guns. The Germans who dared chase it down discovered that the big American brick didn't break apart at terminal velocity. It just got angrier. That's when the Americans started to adapt their tactics. Instead of trying to outturn the Luftwaffe, they climbed high and struck from above. A P-47 pilot could drop like a meteor, unleash a burst from 850 caliber Brownings, and climb back out before the enemy could even blink. The sky filled with tracer rounds so bright that bomber crews below described them as curtains of fire, and the laughter from the German side began to fade. But evolution is never painless. Early missions exposed the plane's weaknesses. Its short fuel range meant bombers were often left alone just when they needed help most. Many P-47 pilots had to bail out over enemy territory after running dry. The Luftwaffe, sensing victory, taunted them again. "Your flying fortress is a gas guzzler," one German ace sneered over the radio. "Bring more fuel next time." Yet behind the scenes, American engineers were already working on drop tanks and range extensions. Every failure became a lesson, every retreat a setup for revenge. The pilots themselves also evolved. Men like Francis Gabby Gabreski, Robert Johnson, and Hubert Zemke began to push the Jug to limits no one had imagined. They discovered that if you kept it high and fast, the Thunderbolt could dominate any fight. Johnson once limped back to base with more than 200 holes in his aircraft. His cockpit flooded with smoke and declared, "She may not dance, but she sure can take a punch." Stories like his spread across airfields like wildfire. New pilots stopped complaining about the plane's weight. They started bragging about it. Then came the turning point. A squadron of Thunderbolts was escorting B-17s on a raid over France when a swarm of German fighters attacked. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the Americans held their ground. One P-47 pilot, out of ammunition, rammed a Bf-109's tail to protect the bombers. Both planes went down, but the message was clear. The Jug was done being the punchline. Command took notice. The reputation of the Thunderbolt began to change from slow heavyweight to unbreakable. Guardian, its massive engine, allowed it to dive at over 500 miles per hour, something the Luftwaffe's finest couldn't risk without tearing their wings off. A new phrase spread through the German ranks. "Don't let it get above you." They had stopped laughing. As 1943 bled into 1944, bomber crews began requesting Thunderbolt escorts by name. "If I see a Jug beside me," one gunner said, "I know I'm coming home." And when those same Jugs returned from missions, blackened with smoke and pocked with shrapnel, the ground crews would pat their armor like the flank of a loyal tank and grin. The P-47 wasn't elegant, but it was loyal. It got you home alive. From that point on, the Allied pilots started to realize they weren't flying an underdog at all. They were flying a brawler, a brute, a beast that could punch holes in anything foolish enough to cross it. The P-47 had stopped being the laughingstock of the sky. It was now the thunder before the storm that would soon rain lead across Europe. By 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had finally found its true voice, and that voice spoke in the deafening rattle of 850 caliber Browning machine guns. Each one spat out 13 rounds a second. Multiply that by 8, and you had more than 100 pieces of lead screaming through the air every heartbeat. When a squadron of Thunderbolts opened fire, the sound was like ripping canvas mixed with rolling thunder. Luftwaffe pilots called it Der amerikanische Donner, the American Thunder. The name stuck. The Thunderbolt had transformed from a clumsy escort into an airborne monster built for destruction. Its pilots now used it for everything: bomber escort, fighter sweeps, and, increasingly, ground attack. The war had changed, and so had the Jug's mission. With the Allies pushing across Europe, every tank, train, and convoy behind German lines became a target, and the P-47 was perfect for the job. Heavy armor, a near-indestructible engine, and the ability to carry bombs and rockets made it the ultimate multitasker of the skies. A typical sortie went something like this. A flight of Thunderbolts would dive from high altitude, engines screaming, guns blazing. 8 Brownings would light up a German convoy, shattering trucks and scattering soldiers. The 50s didn't just pierce metal, they shredded it. The ground shook as 500-pound bombs followed, sending shockwaves through the countryside. Then, before enemy flak could get a lock, the jugs pulled up and vanished into the clouds. The Germans on the ground began calling them Jabo, short for Jagdbomber, the fighter bomber. The name carried fear. In the skies, Luftwaffe pilots still tried to meet them head-on, but the odds were turning. The P-47's altitude advantage, combined with its dive speed, made it a nightmare to fight. A German ace once said, "You never hear the jug that kills you. You just see the tracers, then nothing." At high altitude, the P-47's turbo-supercharged engine gave it an edge that few could match. It could climb to 30,000 feet, escort bombers, and still have the power to dive like a meteor. German pilots discovered that trying to follow one down was suicide. The jug could dive at nearly 550 miles per hour. The Luftwaffe's planes would tear their wings off past 475. American pilots began to trust their aircraft completely. They called it the Flying Fortress's best friend. Robert S. Johnson, one of the top P-47 aces, once took hits from a Focke-Wulf's cannons, had his controls jammed, oil pouring over his windshield, and still refused to bail out. He kicked and punched his canopy until it cracked open, got the stick free, and flew home. When he landed, mechanics counted more than 200 bullet holes in his plane. One mechanic said, "It looks like you've been through hell." Johnson just grinned. "Hell couldn't shoot this bird down." Those kinds of stories became legend. Pilots began to brag about the Thunderbolt's appetite for damage. A typical pre-flight joke went, "If you crash a P-47, just walk away. She'll fix herself." Humor aside, the truth was simple. The jug was nearly unkillable. Its thick armor around the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, and rugged radial engine gave it survival odds that no other fighter could match. A single engine hit in a Messerschmitt meant a fiery descent. A single hit in a Thunderbolt? It just made the pilot mad. As the Allies advanced after D-Day, the P-47 became the scourge of German ground forces. It turned roads, railways, and retreat columns into scrapyards. Tanks that once rolled confidently toward battle now traveled only at night, terrified of the daylight roar of American engines. The Germans began painting camouflage nets over roads and forests, but it didn't matter. If a jug spotted movement, it would swoop down and erase it. Allied troops on the ground loved them. They knew that if they called in a Thunderbolt strike, the enemy wouldn't be standing afterward. By late 1944, the Thunderbolt was carrying 2,500 pounds of bombs, more than some light bombers. Add 10 rockets to that load and it could obliterate a column of tanks in minutes. The Luftwaffe's dominance was cracking. The Germans had once mocked the jug as a flying milk bottle. Now they whispered its name like a curse. Even German intelligence reports showed the shift. One document captured after the war read, "Enemy employs heavy fighter of great strength and firepower, cannot be destroyed easily. Do not engage from below." Another pilot's diary entry was more poetic. "The jug falls from heaven, spits fire and is gone. Only silence follows." In the air, the Thunderbolt had become a symbol of American might, a blunt instrument that didn't bother with finesse. Pilots no longer tried to match the Luftwaffe's agility. They relied on speed, firepower, and armor. Their motto became simple: hit hard, get home. The Luftwaffe, already bleeding pilots and fuel, couldn't keep up. Their jokes had turned to curses, their laughter to dread. The change was so complete that even Allied commanders took notice. General Dwight D. Eisenhower reportedly said that the P-47, more than any other aircraft, broke the German Army's will to fight. The Thunderbolt didn't just win dogfights, it destroyed morale. When German troops saw its silhouette overhead, they ran for cover. When Luftwaffe pilots saw its silver flash in the distance, they turned away. Every time a P-47 squadron roared over Europe, it was as if the sky itself had chosen a side. The laughter that once echoed through the clouds had vanished, replaced by the crackling roar of 8 machine guns spitting thunder. The jug had found its purpose, and it was vengeance wrapped in steel. By the winter of 1944, the Thunderbolt wasn't just an aircraft anymore, it was a reputation, a storm, and a promise that no Allied bomber would fly alone. The Germans had laughed once. Now they prayed they'd never hear that sound again. By early 1945, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. What had once been their proud hunting ground was now a thunderstorm of roaring American engines, the sound of liberation echoing across the clouds. The P-47 Thunderbolt led that storm. Its reputation had transformed from clumsy heavyweight to sky tyrant, a beast so dominant that even German aces admitted defeat before battle. The plane that was once mocked for being too big, too heavy, and too slow had become the most feared silhouette in the sky. Thunderbolts now flew deep into enemy territory, escorting bombers all the way to Berlin. Thanks to new drop tanks, their range had doubled. What was once a weakness became a weapon. For the first time, the B-17s and B-24s could count on a guardian angel that wouldn't abandon them halfway. The Luftwaffe, short on fuel, short on pilots, and crushed by constant raids, could only watch as silver swarms of jugs filled the sky. And they weren't just flying cover. The P-47's new role was absolute air superiority. It didn't matter what the Germans threw at them, Bf-109s, FW-190s, even the advanced Me-262 jets, the Jug had a counter for everything. When the jets appeared, the Thunderbolts couldn't outpace them, but they could trap them. Allied pilots learned to patrol near the Me-262 bases, catching them during takeoff and landing when their engines were slow to spool. Many German jet pilots died before they ever left the runway, shredded by .50 caliber fire raining down from above. But perhaps the Jug's most devastating work came not in the air, but on the ground. After D-Day, P-47 squadrons swept ahead of the advancing Allied armies, turning every German convoy, every tank column, and every railway yard into smoking wreckage. Soldiers called it the whisper of death. You'd hear nothing until the guns opened up, and then it was already too late. With bombs under its wings and rockets slung beneath, the Thunderbolt could deliver more firepower than a small artillery battery. The Germans tried everything. They camouflaged tanks, hid convoys under trees, even parked decoy vehicles made of wood. But the Jug pilots weren't fooled. They'd drop low, sometimes below treetop level, and light up anything that moved. German soldiers described it as being attacked by thunder itself. A single P-47 could cripple a supply line in minutes. Trains derailed, bridges vanished, columns of smoke marked every highway. The Luftwaffe had no answer. Their airfields were under constant assault, and the few planes that managed to take off were met by swarms of Thunderbolts that outnumbered them 10-1. Pilots began carving legends out of the sky. Francis "Gabby" Gabreski became America's top ace in Europe with 28 victories, all in the Thunderbolt. Robert S. Johnson survived missions that defied reason, bringing back aircraft that looked more like Swiss cheese than airplanes. Zemke Schilling and countless others turned the Jug into a weapon of myth. They painted their names, teeth, and slogans on the fuselage, flying steel monsters with personality. Little Chief, Pengy, Lucky 7. Each one had stories written in gunpowder, and behind every mission was the same truth. The Jug brought its pilots home. The rugged radial engine, the armored cockpit, the sheer brute construction. It all gave American flyers confidence no other aircraft could. When they faced German flak, they stayed low and kept shooting, trusting that the Jug could take whatever the enemy threw. One pilot joked, "You don't land a P-47, you wrestle it to the ground." But they loved it for that. Even bomber crews began calling the Thunderbolt their guardian angel. They'd look out their windows during missions and see those fat-bodied fighters flying formation beside them, guns ready. When the Jugs were there, one B-17 gunner recalled, "We felt invincible." The Luftwaffe knew it too. The once fearsome German interceptors now had to climb into the sky, knowing they were outnumbered, outgunned, and out-armored. One German pilot summed it up grimly after the war. Fighting the Thunderbolt was like boxing a bear. You might land a punch, but it didn't matter. The bear just got angrier. By the end of 1944, the statistics told the story. Thunderbolts had destroyed more than 3,700 enemy aircraft in the air, and tens of thousands of vehicles, locomotives, and tanks on the ground. They became so effective that entire German divisions refused to move during daylight hours. When the jugs appeared, troops dived into ditches, trucks skidded off roads, and anti-aircraft gunners prayed for clouds. The dominance of the Thunderbolt was absolute, but it wasn't just about firepower. It was psychological. The Germans had once mocked it as the flying milk jug, but now even the mention of its name could make soldiers flinch. The deep growling roar of its engine meant doom. American troops advancing on the ground would often point upward and cheer when they saw one. "That's our Thunder," they'd say. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self. Pilots were scarce, fuel was nearly gone, and the last remnants of the once mighty German Air Force could do little more than delay the inevitable. The jug owned the daylight skies. Its silver body reflected the sun like a blade, its guns glinting in the light before unleashing hell. And still, even after months of relentless combat, the Thunderbolt refused to quit. It flew from Normandy to the Rhine, from the Ardennes to Berlin, through snow, smoke, and flak. It was there during the Battle of the Bulge, hammering German positions trapped by winter. When Allied tanks needed cover, the P-47s were there. When paratroopers cried for help, the jugs answered with rockets and bombs. By the spring of 1945, the mockery of 1943 felt like ancient history. The Germans weren't laughing anymore. They were running, hiding, surrendering, anything to escape the wrath of the jug. The thunder that once rumbled faintly in the distance now rolled endlessly overhead, and every time it passed, it left behind only silence, smoke, and victory. The Luftwaffe had laughed at the Thunderbolt once. Now they could only listen to the echo of its guns and wonder how they had ever thought such a beast could be funny. Even bomber crews began calling the Thunderbolt their guardian angel. They'd look out their windows during missions and see those fat-bodied fighters flying formation beside them, guns ready. "When the jugs were there," one B-17 gunner recalled, "we felt invincible. The Luftwaffe knew it too." The once fearsome German interceptors now had to climb into the sky, knowing they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outarmored. One German pilot summed it up grimly after the war. "Fighting the Thunderbolt was like boxing a bear. You might land a punch, but it didn't matter. The bear just got angrier." By the end of 1944, the statistics told the story. Thunderbolts had destroyed more than 3,700 enemy aircraft in the air, and tens of thousands of vehicles, locomotives, and tanks on the ground. They became so effective that entire German divisions refused to move during daylight hours. When the jugs appeared, troops dived into ditches, trucks skidded off roads, and anti-aircraft gunners prayed for clouds. The dominance of the Thunderbolt was absolute, but it wasn't just about firepower. It was psychological. The Germans had once mocked it as the flying milk jug, but now even the mention of its name could make soldiers flinch. The deep growling roar of its engine meant doom. American troops advancing on the ground would often point upward and cheer when they saw one. "That's our Thunder," they'd say. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self. Pilots were scarce, fuel was nearly gone, and the last remnants of the once mighty German Air Force could do little more than delay the inevitable. The jug owned the daylight skies. Its silver body reflected the sun like a blade, its guns glinting in the light before unleashing hell. And still, even after months of relentless combat, the Thunderbolt refused to quit. It flew from Normandy to the Rhine, from the Ardennes to Berlin, through snow, smoke, and flak. It was there during the Battle of the Bulge, hammering German positions trapped by winter. When Allied tanks needed cover, the P-47s were there. When paratroopers cried for help, the jugs answered with rockets and bombs. By the spring of 1945, the mockery of 1943 felt like ancient history. The Germans weren't laughing anymore. They were running, hiding, surrendering, anything to escape the wrath of the jug. The thunder that once rumbled faintly in the distance now rolled endlessly overhead, and every time it passed, it left behind only silence, smoke, and victory. The Luftwaffe had laughed at the Thunderbolt once. Now they could only listen to the echo of its guns and wonder how they had ever thought such a beast could be funny. "You said," ChatGPT said, when the war finally fell silent in May 1945, the skies that had once thundered with roaring engines and gunfire were suddenly still. The P-47 Thunderbolt, that great metal brute once mocked as a flying milk jug, had helped bring that silence. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was gone. German pilots who had laughed at the Thunderbolt in 1943 now sat in prison camps, shaking their heads and muttering that nothing could stand up to it. The Americans had proven that sometimes brute strength, not elegance, wins wars. Pilots who had flown the Jug came home with stories that bordered on unbelievable. They talked about limping back to base with wings shredded, control cables cut, engines coughing smoke, yet somehow still managing to land. They told of dogfights where the Thunderbolt took a hit that would have split another plane in two and just kept charging forward. One veteran joked, "You could saw the tail off a Jug, and it'd still try to fly home." That was its personality, tough, relentless, almost stubbornly alive. After the war, historians would call the Thunderbolt the most underrated hero of the European air campaign. It wasn't sleek like the Spitfire, nor famous like the Mustang, but it did the dirty work. It flew over Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Ruhr, smashing railroads, tanks, and anything else that moved. It was the flying hammer in a war that demanded hammers, and even when the sleek new P-51 Mustang arrived, pilots still swore by the Jug. "If I'm going to dogfight, give me a Mustang," one said. "If I want to come home, give me a Thunderbolt." Its design influenced generations of aircraft. Engineers learned from its durability, its powerful radial engine, its ability to carry massive loads without complaint. The lessons of the Jug's toughness echoed into Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. You can even see its DNA in the A-10 Warthog, another big, ugly, beautiful tank killer that soldiers came to love. The same spirit lived on. Not the fastest, not the prettiest, but the one you could trust when everything else was falling apart. And in the hearts of those who flew it, the Jug was more than a machine. It was a partner. Pilots painted its nose with shark teeth, checkerboards, pin-up girls, anything to give it a bit of personality. They talked to it before missions. They patted the fuselage before takeoff, whispered, "Let's get back in one piece." And more often than not, it did. Some even credited it with saving their lives when physics said they shouldn't have survived. There was something almost mythical about the bond between a Thunderbolt and its pilot. In Germany, the stories were different. Captured Luftwaffe veterans admitted that by 1944, they feared the Jug more than any other Allied plane. "You could shoot at it until your guns were empty," one said, "and it would still be coming." Another German ace compared facing a P-47 to trying to punch through a mountain. The laughter that once echoed across the radio waves was gone, replaced by grudging respect. When the U.S. Army Air Forces began counting its accomplishments, the numbers were staggering. Thunderbolts destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air, and tens of thousands more on the ground. They flew more than 500,000 combat sorties, and through it all, their loss rate remained astonishingly low for the number of missions flown. The P-47 didn't just fight, it endured. After the war, thousands of Jugs were shipped home, scrapped or sold to Allied nations. Some found new lives in South America, France, and even China. But wherever they went, their legend followed. Pilots who had once cursed its weight now called it the plane that could take you to hell and bring you back. Even as jet fighters took over the skies, old Thunderbolts still rumbled through the clouds of post-war air shows, a reminder of a time when courage came wrapped in riveted steel. The Thunderbolt story is, at its heart, a story about perception. The Germans saw an overweight joke. The Americans saw a problem child. But war has a way of revealing character, and the Jug's character was indestructible. It wasn't born graceful, it was born strong. It didn't win with beauty, it won with grit. And in doing so, it became something no one could ignore. Today, when aviation historians talk about the P-47, there's a note of affection in their voices. It's the underdog that became the heavyweight champion. It's the reminder that what matters isn't how you start, it's how you finish. When the laughter faded and the smoke cleared, the P-47 stood tall, its .850 caliber guns still warm, its pilots alive, and its enemies humbled. If you stand near one today, in a museum hangar or on an airfield, you can almost feel it hum, that deep, rolling growl from the engine, like thunder building behind the clouds. You can imagine the laughter of those early Luftwaffe pilots, sharp and mocking, echoing across 1943, and then imagine how quickly that laughter vanished when the Jug appeared overhead, spewing lead and vengeance. Because in the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt didn't need to be pretty. It didn't need to be fast. It just needed to fly, fight, and come home. And it did all three better than anyone ever expected. The Germans laughed first, but the last sound they heard was thunder.